Alara stood on the crest of the ridge, a solitary figure etched against a sky the color of old pewter. The wind, a constant and unforgiving bully on this high plateau, tore at the threadbare wool of her shawl, pulling the last vestiges of warmth from her bones. It was late autumn, a season of endings, and for her it felt like the end of everything. Below, nestled in the valley like a clutch of protected eggs, lay the town of Oakhaven, its chimneys breathing thin plumes of smoke that were immediately snatched and shredded by the same wind that assaulted her. Just weeks ago, one of those chimneys had been hers. Now her world had been reduced to this: a 10-acre plot of worthless land deeded to her not out of kindness, but as a final public act of severance. The plot was known to the townsfolk as the Scour. The name was an honest one. The land was a scar on the landscape, a place where the topsoil had long ago surrendered to the wind, leaving behind a hard pan of clay and stone that grew little more than stubborn grasses and thistle. It was considered the town's attic, a place for things forgotten and unwanted. No one had ever tried to build here, not seriously. The exposure was too severe, the ground too mean. To be given the Scour was to be told, without words, to leave, or to perish. The architect of her exile was Marcus, her late husband's brother. Liam had been a man of quiet strength, his presence a buffer between Alara and the rigid paternalistic customs of his family. With his sudden death from a fever that had swept through the valley, that buffer was gone. Marcus, a man whose ambition was as sharp and cold as the November air, had moved swiftly. He had invoked an old unspoken law of patrimony, arguing before the town elders that the main farmstead, the warm and fertile heart of the family's holdings, could not pass to an outsider, a woman with no blood claim. Alara, still shrouded in the fog of grief, had been too stunned to fight effectively. The elders, men who had known Marcus his entire life and her for only the 5 years she had been Liam's wife, had sided with him. The Scour was her consolation prize, a piece of land so utterly devoid of value that giving it to her felt more like a curse than a charity. She clutched the deed in her pocket, the paper a brittle reminder of her powerlessness. Her savings were nearly gone, spent on the doctor for Liam, and now dwindling with each passing day. The thought of returning to the family she had left behind, a family hundreds of miles away who had disapproved of her marriage to a simple farmer, was a humiliation she could not bear. Oakhaven was the only home she knew now, even if it was in the process of casting her out. She had nowhere to go. And so she stood on the land that was meant to be her stepping stone to oblivion, and she felt a flicker of something hard and stubborn ignite in the cold pit of her stomach. It was not hope, not yet. It was defiance. The property possessed only 2 features of note. The first was a single, ancient oak tree, its branches twisted into arthritic shapes by a lifetime of wrestling with the wind. It stood near the center of the plot, a monument to endurance. The second, near the base of the oak, was a depression in the earth, a shallow crater filled with fallen leaves and the debris of seasons past. Liam had once told her it was the remains of an old root cellar, abandoned by some forgotten settler a century ago. Its stone walls had long since collapsed, leaving only a hint of its former purpose. It was a grave for a failed dream. As dusk began to bleed across the horizon, the temperature plummeted. The wind grew teeth. Alara knew she could not spend the night exposed. She had a small canvas tent, a few blankets, and a satchel with the last of her food, but that was a temporary shield against a permanent problem. Winter was not coming. It was already here, laying siege to the highlands. She made her way to the collapsed cellar, seeking the meager shelter of its earthen banks. She cleared away the leaves and loose stones, huddling in the hollow as the first stars pricked the darkening sky. The wind howled over her head, a mournful, hungry sound, but down in the depression, its force was broken. It was still bitterly cold, but the raw, cutting edge of the gale was gone. She pressed her hand against the packed earth of the cellar wall. It was cold, yes, but it was a different kind of cold than the air. The air was a blade, sharp and actively stealing heat. The earth was a cold stone, passive, unchanging. It held a deep, resonant stillness. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Her grandmother, a woman of the old country with hands that were always stained with soil, telling her stories as a child. "The earth has a slow heart," she used to say. "It does not race with the sun, nor does it panic in the blizzard. It keeps its own time, its own temperature. Deep enough, it is always the same." That night, huddled in her blankets, Alara did not sleep. She thought, the people of Oakhaven built their houses tall, of thick timber, to stand up against the wind and the snow. They fought the winter, a constant exhausting battle of stoked fires and patched walls. Their homes were fortresses, islands in a sea of cold. But they were always under siege. What if, she thought, the fight was the mistake? What if the answer was not to stand against the winter, but to step aside from it? Not to build up, but to dig down. The idea was a spark, small and fragile, in the vast darkness of her despair. She thought of the badgers and the foxes who dug their dens and slept warm through the worst of the storms. They did not build fortresses. They found sanctuary. By morning, the spark had become a plan. It was a mad plan, born of desperation and a half-remembered piece of folklore, but it was hers. She would not try to build a cabin on the scour. She would resurrect the old root cellar. She would dig it out, deepen it, expand it, and make the earth itself her walls and her roof. She would not fight the wind. She would live beneath it. She would not battle the cold. She would borrow the earth's deep, abiding coolness, which in the heart of winter would feel like warmth. Her first day was one of assessment. She used a broken branch to probe the collapsed cellar, mapping its original dimensions. It seemed to have been a simple rectangle, perhaps 10 feet by 15. The stones of its walls were still there, buried under a century of soil and neglect. She owned a few of Liam's tools, a sturdy spade, a pickaxe with a slightly loose head, and a wheelbarrow with a wobbly wheel. They would have to be enough. The work was brutal. The top layer of soil was loose enough, but a foot down she hit the hard-pan clay, studded with rocks that ranged from the size of a fist to the size of a loaf of bread. Each shovelful was a negotiation. Each swing of the pickaxe sent jarring vibrations up her arms. By the end of the first day, her hands were raw, her back a single throbbing ache. She had managed to clear a space barely large enough to lie down in, a shallow trench that offered little more protection than the original depression. As she ate her cold meal of bread and dried meat, doubt began to creep in. The sheer scale of the task seemed insurmountable. The weight of the earth was immense, and she was just one woman, weary with grief and fueled by little more than stubbornness. The next morning, Silas, the town blacksmith, made his way up the ridge. He was a man built like the anvils he worked, broad and solid, with a face that looked as though it had been forged in heat and cooled in skepticism. He carried a small sack. He did not offer pleasantries. "Heard what Marcus did," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's a black mark on his soul. But this—" He gestured with his chin toward her pathetic trench. "This is folly, Alara. You'll die of exposure before the first true snow." She leaned on her shovel, forcing herself to stand straight despite the protests of her muscles. "It's a start, Silas," he grunted, unconvinced. He set the sack down. "Brought you some things. Sharpening stone for the spade, a wedge for that pick handle, and my wife sent some stew. You can't live on Defiance alone." He looked at the pile of rocks she had excavated. "What's the plan? Build a stone wall to break the wind?" Alara took a deep breath. She knew how it would sound. "I'm not building up. I'm digging down. I'm going to live in the cellar." Silas stared at her for a long moment. His expression did not change, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. pity. He thought her grief had finally broken her mind. "Like a badger in a den," he said, his tone flat. He shook his head slowly. "The damp will get in your bones. The earth will sweat in the summer and freeze in the winter. It's no place for a person." "Deep enough it won't freeze," she said, the words of her grandmother giving her a strange confidence. "The earth holds a steady temperature." "That's fine for potatoes, Alara, not for people." He kicked at a loose clod of clay. "You can't stay here. There's a room at the Widow Hemlock's boarding house. I can speak to her. We can take up a collection in town to see you through the winter." The offer was kind, but it was charity. It was an admission of defeat. It would make her a ward of the town, a permanent object of their pity and a testament to Marcus's victory. "No," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "Thank you, Silas, for the tools and the stew. But this is my land. I will make my home here." He looked from her determined face to the pitiful hole in the ground and back again. He sighed, a sound of profound resignation. "As you will." He turned to leave, then paused. "Use the oak for your main beam if you get that far. It's ironwood. It'll hold the weight of the world. But you'll need a cross-cut saw to get through it, and more strength than you've got." He walked away without another word, a silhouette of pragmatic disapproval against the gray sky. His visit, meant to dissuade her, had the opposite effect. His pity was a whetstone for her resolve. The town saw her as a fragile victim. She would show them something else. That day, she dug with a fury, the rhythmic shock of the pickaxe, a counterpoint to the turmoil in her heart. She was not just digging a hole. She was carving out a space for herself in a world that had told her there was none left. Days bled into weeks. A routine established itself, dictated by the rising and setting of the sun and the endurance of her body. She would wake at dawn, her muscles stiff and protesting, and work until her hands were too blistered and her back too strained to continue. She learned the language of the ground. She learned to read the seams in the clay, to anticipate where the rocks would be. She learned to use a smaller shovel to work in the tight corners, and to use the leverage of a crowbar Liam had owned to move stones too heavy to lift. The pile of excavated earth and rock grew into a small mountain beside the hole. News of her strange project trickled down into Oakhaven. At first it was a subject of concerned whispers. Soon it became a source of morbid entertainment. Marcus, emboldened by his success and the town's tacit approval, began to visit her ridge. He would not approach her directly, but would stand at a distance with one of his cronies, his laughter carrying on the wind. He gave her a name. The Mole Woman, he called her, and the name stuck. Children would dare each other to run up the hill and peek into her hole, scurrying away with giggles when she looked up from her work. The women of the town would shake their heads at the market. Poor thing. The grief has taken her senses. Alara heard the whispers. She felt the eyes on her. But she had no energy to spare for shame or anger. Every ounce of her being was poured into the earth. The hole deepened. It was no longer a trench, but a room. She had uncovered the original stone walls of the cellar, rough-hewn but solid. Using them as a guide, she expanded the space, digging back into the hillside, creating a long rectangular chamber. She learned to shore up the earthen walls with timber, scavenged from a collapsed section of fence at the edge of her property. It was slow, agonizing work. A small landslide in one corner set her back 2 full days, a setback that brought her to the edge of tears. But she had simply picked up her shovel and begun again. One afternoon, Silas returned. He did not bring stew this time, but a long, 2-handled crosscut saw. He set it down without a word and watched her work for a time. She was using a rope and a crude ramp to haul larger rocks out of the pit. Her movements were economical now, stripped of any wasted effort. She was thinner, her face smudged with dirt, but her arms and shoulders had gained a wiry strength. "You're still at it," he stated, the surprise evident in his tone. "Still here," she replied, not breaking her rhythm. He looked at the growing chamber, at the neat stacks of salvaged stone, at the shoring timbers. He walked to the edge and peered down. It was now nearly 8 feet deep. "I'll be damned," he muttered, almost to himself. "You've actually done it." "Not yet," she said. "I need a roof." He nodded toward the great oak. "Told you what you'd need. That saw is for you. But it takes 2 to work it." It was the closest he could come to offering help, to admitting he had been wrong to dismiss her so easily. For the first time in a long time, Ilara felt a warmth that had nothing to do with physical exertion. She looked at the blacksmith, his gruff exterior a poor shield for a decent heart. "Then I'm grateful for the loan of the saw," she said. "And for the second pair of hands when you can spare them." He grunted, a sound that was half agreement, half embarrassment. The next Saturday he returned. Together they felled a thick, straight branch from the ancient oak. The saw sang as it bit into the wood, sawdust flying. It was a task she could never have accomplished alone. They trimmed it and, with immense effort, lowered it into the pit, setting it as the main ridge beam, resting on the top of the old stone walls. Silas, with his carpenter's eye, helped her set smaller log rafters, their ends resting on the beam and digging into the packed earth of the hillside. He still thought the idea was fundamentally flawed. "It'll be a damp, dark hole, Ilara," he warned as they worked. "A place to survive, maybe. Not to live." "Survival is enough for now," she answered. The roofing was the final, critical stage. Over the log rafters, she laid a thick layer of oilcloth she had bought with the last of her money. On top of that, they piled hay and dried grasses for insulation. And then came the earth. They shoveled the excavated dirt back onto the roof, packing it down until the structure was buried, a gentle mound rising from the ground. She left an opening for a door at the front, which faced away from the prevailing wind, and a small hole in the roof for a stovepipe. The final touch was to transplant the tough, wind-beaten sod from the surrounding land onto the earthen roof. Within a week, it would be almost impossible to distinguish her home from the rest of the hillside, save for the low stone entrance and the crooked chimney pipe. Inside, it was a different world. The air was still and cool, utterly silent. The roar of the wind, a constant companion for months, was gone, replaced by a profound, muffled peace. The only light came from the open doorway. It was a cave, a den, a tomb. But it was also a fortress of a kind no one in Oakhaven had ever conceived of. She built a door from scavenged planks. She bought a small, pot-bellied stove and enough pipe to reach through the roof, a purchase that used the very last of her coin. She moved her few belongings inside, a cot, a small table, a chair, her blankets. She built rough shelves into the earthen walls. She used the stones she had dug out to build a retaining wall around the entrance, and a small hearth for the stove. Her home was made of the very land that was supposed to destroy her. The first snow came not as a gentle dusting, but as a vanguard for the blizzard that followed. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind began to shriek. The old-timers in Oakhaven looked to the sky, spat, and declared that the white maw was coming early this year. It was a name for the kind of storm that settled in for days, that buried houses to their eaves and froze livestock in their barns. It was a killer storm. In the town there was a frantic rush of preparation. Shutters were bolted, firewood was brought inside, and livestock were secured. Marcus, who had just completed a large new barn with a modern, high-peaked roof designed to shed snow, boasted loudly at the general store that he was more than ready. He looked out the window toward the ridge where Ilara lived. "Hope the mole woman dug deep enough," he said to a round of cruel laughter. "She'll be buried for good this time." Ilara, inside her earth home, felt the change in the world outside. The light in her doorway faded to a dim gray. The temperature inside her shelter, which had held steady at a cool but bearable 50 degrees, began to feel positively warm as the air temperature outside plunged below freezing. She lit a small fire in her stove. The little iron box radiated a surprising amount of heat, and the small enclosed space warmed quickly. There were no drafts. The thick earthen walls held the warmth like a kiln. She cooked a simple meal of potatoes and salted pork, the smell filling her small home. She sat at her table listening. She could hear nothing, no wind, no howling, nothing. The silence was absolute, the most profound luxury she had ever known. The storm hit Oakhaven with the force of a physical blow. The wind drove the snow horizontally, piling it into immense drifts. The temperature dropped to levels that were dangerous for anyone caught outside for more than a few minutes. For 3 days, the White Maw raged. In town, the battle was constant. The wind found every crack in the old wooden houses. Families huddled around their fireplaces, burning through their woodpiles at an alarming rate. On the second day, a section of the roof on the general store collapsed under the weight of the snow. The sound of splintering wood was a common terror. Marcus's new barn, his pride and joy, became his nightmare. The high-peaked roof, designed to shed snow, instead acted as a sail in the unprecedented winds. The structure groaned and twisted. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap, the main truss snapped, and a huge section of the roof caved in, crushing half of his herd. Silas, in his sturdy, well-built home, was faring better than most, but the relentless cold was a constant enemy. The thought of Alara, alone on that windswept ridge, gnawed at him. He had seen her finish the shelter. He had seen her move in. But he still couldn't shake the image of it being a cold, damp tomb. He imagined the snow piling up, blocking her entrance, trapping her. He imagined her freezing in the dark. The guilt was a heavy weight. He had helped her, yes, but he had never truly believed. He had treated her like a foolish child, and now she was likely paying the price for her stubbornness. On the third day, the wind lessened slightly, though the snow continued to fall heavily. Silas could bear it no longer. He bundled himself in every layer of wool and leather he owned, took up a heavy snow shovel, and told his wife he was going to check on Alara. It was a fool's errand, she told him. He would be lucky not to get lost and freeze himself. But he had to know. The journey was a nightmare. The familiar landscape was gone, buried under a rolling sea of white. Drifts were over his head in places. The wind scoured his exposed face, and the cold was a physical pain in his lungs. It took him over an hour to travel a distance he could normally walk in 15 minutes. As he approached the scour, his heart sank. He could see nothing. The entire ridge was a smooth, featureless wave of snow. The great oak was a skeleton plastered in white. There was no sign of a dwelling, no sign of life. He was too late. He pushed forward, his mind a numb haze of grief and regret. He stumbled toward where he remembered her entrance being. And then he saw it. A thin, almost invisible wisp of gray smoke, rising from a small pipe that barely cleared the surface of the snow. It was not the thick, panicked smoke of a fire fighting for its life against the cold. It was a calm, steady breath. She was alive. He began to dig frantically at the snow around the pipe. The snow was light and deep. After a few minutes of desperate work, his shovel struck something hard. Wood, the top of her doorframe. He cleared more snow, his breath coming in ragged, steaming clouds. He uncovered the door, a small rectangle of darkness in the overwhelming white. He pounded on it with his gloved fist. "Alara, are you in there? Alara!" The door creaked open. Alara stood there, holding a small lantern. She was wearing a simple wool dress. Her face was calm. Behind her, the small room was bathed in a warm, gentle light. The air that wafted out was not the frigid air of a tomb, but the warm, dry air of a comfortable home, smelling faintly of wood smoke and stew. Silas stared, unable to process the scene. He was covered in snow, half frozen, his beard caked with ice. He had just fought his way through a landscape of pure elemental violence. And here, inches away, was a pocket of absolute peace. The contrast was so profound it felt like a hallucination. He saw her small stove glowing cherry red in the corner. He saw a book lying open on her table. He saw a kettle steaming gently on the stovetop. He looked from the serene warmth of her home to the howling blizzard behind him, the snow already starting to fill in the hole he had dug. He looked back at her calm, questioning face. All his certainty, all his practical, grounded wisdom, all the conventional knowledge of his entire life crumbled in that moment. She had not been mad. She had been a prophet. He could not form a complete sentence. A single word escaped his lips, a question that contained all of his awe and disbelief. How? Alara offered a small, tired smile. I didn't fight it, she said softly. I went under. She stepped back and held the door open for him. He stumbled inside, bringing a swirl of snow with him. As she closed the door, the world disappeared. The roar of the wind was gone, cut off as if by a knife. All that remained was the quiet crackle of the fire and the sound of their breathing. Silas stood in the center of the room, slowly unthawing, looking at the smooth earthen walls, the sturdy ceiling of logs, and the impossible warmth. He had come expecting to find a body to recover. He had found the safest, warmest home in all of Oak Haven. He finally lowered himself into her chair, his whole body trembling with cold and revelation. I'll be damned, he whispered again, this time not with skepticism, but with reverence. When the white maw finally broke and a pale, watery sun emerged, Oak Haven looked like a battlefield. The devastation was widespread. Roofs were down, livestock lost, stores of firewood depleted. The story of Marcus's barn was already the stuff of grim legend. It took days for people to dig themselves out, to check on their neighbors, to count their losses. Silas's story spread through the town faster than the thaw. He told them what he had found on the ridge. Not a frozen tomb, but a warm, secure haven. He described the silence, the steady warmth, the sheer, unbelievable practicality of it. He told the story with the zeal of a convert, shaming anyone who had ever laughed at her. The name they had given her, the Mole Woman, was spoken now not with scorn, but with a kind of grudging awe. People began to make the trek up to the scour, not to mock, but to see. They stood before her low, unassuming entrance, marveling at the simplicity of the idea. They saw the great mounds of displaced stone and earth and understood for the first time the sheer scale of the labor she had undertaken alone. They saw a home that had not been battered by the storm, but had simply shrugged it off. It had not won a fight, it had refused to participate in one. Marcus, his fortune decimated, and his pride in tatters, saw the procession of his neighbors heading up the hill, and was consumed by a bitter, impotent fury. He had built his monument to prosperity high, and the storm had torn it down. She had hidden herself in the dirt, and the storm had never even seen her. It was an inversion of the natural order as he understood it. His power, his standing, his wealth, all of it had proven as fragile as a pane of glass in a hurricane. Her quiet, stubborn work had created something far more resilient. Alara's life changed. She was no longer the pitiful outsider. She became a source of wisdom. People who had once dismissed her now came seeking her advice. How did you shore up the walls? How deep did you lay the rafters? How do you manage the damp? She answered their questions patiently, explaining the simple principles she had learned through trial and error. The next year, several families on the high-lying farms began digging their own winter holds, as they came to be called. Alara's folly had become Alara's method. She never became wealthy. She never sought power. But she found something far more valuable: security. Her home was cool in the oppressive heat of summer, and warm in the biting cold of winter. It asked for little, a small amount of wood for the stove, the labor of her own hands to maintain it. She planted a garden on the land that had been deemed barren, using the rich soil she had excavated from deep below. The earth, it turned out, was only poor on the surface. Deeper down, it was full of life. Years later, looking back, the narrative of Ilara's struggle would settle into the shape of a local legend. It became a story told to children to teach them the value of perseverance. But the true lesson was deeper than that. It was a story about the nature of strength. The people of Oakhaven had always believed strength was about resistance, about building walls thick enough and roofs strong enough to withstand the onslaught of the world. Ilara had shown them a different kind of strength, the wisdom of yielding, of finding shelter not by standing taller but by nestling deeper. It was a lesson in humility, a reminder that the most powerful forces are often the quietest. The wind howls and the blizzard rages, but the earth, with its slow, steady heart, endures. She had listened to that heart, and it had given her a home. She had looked at a piece of land that everyone else had thrown away, and she had seen not its emptiness, but its depth.